Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Darrel Good analyzes the USDA's April crop report. Roger Elmore gives an update on cover crops research in corn and soybean production. Ben Beckman explains how applicators can recycle pesticide containers, and Tamara Jackson-Zims discusses corn seedling diseases. Darrel Good from the University of Illinois is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA's April crop report shows an increase in corn ending stocks and a decrease in soybean ending stocks. The agency's supply and demand estimates released Tuesday lower corn feed and residual use, but raise the amount of corn used for ethanol. In South America, the USDA thinks precipitation during February and March was enough to raise Argentina's corn production by 1 million metric tons. It also bumped the country's soybean output by 500,000 metric tons, but kept Brazil's harvest untouched. We talked with Darrel Tuesday afternoon and started by asking for his thoughts on this month's projections.
You know, I think there were a couple surprises there, Jeff. I was looking at what USDA would do with the feed and residual number on corn following the March 1 stocks number, and they did lower their projection for the year by 50 million bushels, which I thought was a bit of a surprise. I thought they might hold steady. On soybeans, we did see a bump up in the export projection, which I think is probably justified by our current pace of shipments and sales. I was thinking maybe a 10 million increase. We saw 15, so I think everything pretty much within the realm of expectations, maybe a slight surprise on the corn feed number.
Yeah, can you expand on that a little bit based off of the numbers that you've been working on earlier this year to try and figure out what the usage was and maybe why that was a little bit surprising today?
What we look at is the March 1 stocks number, and we use that to calculate a feed and residual disappearance during the second quarter of the marketing year. And then we combine that with the disappearance during the first quarter. So obviously you get total disappearance through the first half, and then ask the question, is the pace in the first half sufficient to reach what USDA is projecting for the year? And we did see first half use about 68% of what USDA had been projecting at 5.3 billion bushels, and thought that was sufficient pace of consumption to justify holding the number at 5.3. They chose to take 50 million bushels off of that number.
From these sheets and from what you've been tracking, Darrel, are you comfortable with where corn and soybean exports are right now?
We really are. As I mentioned, I think soybean exports have been a little stronger than expected and justified the increase in the projection. For the first half of the year, corn exports were really disappointing, and I think raised some question whether we could reach USDA's number. But that pace has really picked up in the last 3-4 weeks, and the pace of sales has also accelerated. So now I think we're pretty comfortable that we can reach the 1.65 billion bushels that USDA continues to forecast.
USDA made slight increases in Argentina in both corn and soybeans, but didn't change the output in Brazil. Are there implications right now to that?
You know, I don't think strong implications. It's not a complete surprise. I think given the weather conditions in Argentina have been generally moist there, that we might see a slight increase in production numbers. So I don't think it'll really alter the expectations of U.S. exports at this point. The bigger question, I think, longer term, being the next month or so, is really going to be Brazilian corn weather. We are seeing some early indications of some stress there. If that persists, that becomes a bigger story, I think, than what we saw in today's numbers.
If we go back to the March 31st prospective plantings report, you look at corn, 93.6 million, soybeans, 82.2 million acres. Do you think that there's some switching that has occurred or will occur before the planting season is over?
You know, I tend to think there will be some modest switching given the price reaction we've had since that report was released. Soybeans are considerably stronger than when the survey was done, and corn prices are steady to a bit weaker than when the farmers were surveyed. So I wouldn't be surprised to see up to 1 million acres perhaps move away from corn to soybeans or perhaps some other crops. But again, 1 million acres probably doesn't alter the supply expectation very much.
Well, talking about that supply expectations, do you have an expectation of if we're going to be at, above, or below trend line yield in corn this year?
A bit of an expectation. I first would say that our calculation of trend yield for both corn and soybeans would be a bit less than USDA's calculated trend, so we start a little lower than they start. And then we continue to monitor the El Nino episode that tends to be fading pretty quickly right now, and that suggests to us that we may have an elevated risk of below trend yields this year. So we start with a lower trend yield on corn, 166.2, and then I'd want to fade that 3 or 4 bushels in my expectation right now. We'd start at 45.2 bushels on soybeans and fade that a bushel or so based on the El Nino.
How does that impact what you think farmers should put into their marketing plans as they try to pencil out some selling strategies over the next month or two?
You know, if you buy into that scenario, and not everybody does, but if you're really looking for that kind of switch in acreage and below trend yields, that says to me to remain patient on new crop pricing. That while we have seen some strength in soybean prices, I think there's some more upside potential, and I think corn continues to drag along the bottom. So I don't see a lot of downside risk there. Certainly, depending on how summer weather unfolds, we could see some big yields again, but I don't think the market's going to reflect that anytime soon. So I think steady as we go, remain patient, and give the market a little more chance.
And that holds in soybeans as well, Darrel?
It does. Even though we have seen some strength, I think there may be some more left there.
Next week, Roy Smith will give us his thoughts on corn and soybean markets. The USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service believes India will once again be the world's top exporter of beef. Projections released for 2016 this week show Brazil rising to second place, with Australia falling from first to third. The U.S. is expected to be fourth for the 6th year in a row. The United States is forecasted to be the largest importer of beef, but the FAS sees China overtaking Japan as the second biggest importer. You may have heard about the wildfire that began in Kansas during late March and burned more than 365,000 acres. Nebraska Extension's Karla Jenkins says a wildfire in Nebraska recently burned over 8,000 acres of native range in the Sandhills. She says that type of disaster could lead to a shortage of forage for producers and explains what they might be able to do in those situations.
So recent range fires have left some producers short on summer range, and so one option they can have is to partially confine cows to feed them to get past this time when the range needs to rest. And we can do that on crop ground, we can do that on a pivot corner. We don't have to have a feedlot. We can feed under a hot fence wire. We need to give cows lots of space so that they have plenty of room to get up there and not push through the wire. And we need to remember that these are probably going to be lactating pairs, and so they're going to have a higher requirement than the gestating cow that producers are used to feeding. And so we need to make sure that the energy in the diet is enough to meet the cow's needs, and that the baby calf has plenty of access to feed, as well as the water source that they have there in that pen. And so this will give our grass some time to rest. We can use some energy-dense feeds like wet distillers grains, maybe some poor quality hay such as a straw, or just use some medium quality meadow hay with some additional energy sources added. Producers can get help balancing rations from extension personnel so that we can keep cows in adequate condition to breed, since they're not going to be on their typical home range.
Karla has written an article with more information about emergency confinement feeding after a disaster. You can find that online at beef.unl.edu. We've told you previously about a University of Nebraska-Lincoln multi-site study aimed at learning more about the use of cover crops. Nebraska Extension's Roger Elmore says researchers are now expanding that work to answer more questions about how cover crops might impact corn and soybean production systems. We talked with Roger earlier this week at UNL's Havelock Fields in the northeast section of Lincoln to get an update on some preliminary results.
We're doing, the Corn and Soybean Board came alongside us in 2014 to start our work on cover crops. 4 locations, 2 irrigated, 2 dryland, Concord and Meade are the 2 dryland locations. We're at Clay Center and Brule for the 2 irrigated locations. So Brule is almost to the panhandle out in western Nebraska, Clay Center in south central Nebraska. Their main interest in supporting our research was to see what is the impact of cover crops on corn and soybean yields. And can you produce a good set of cover crops which have various ecosystem values and contributions? Can you produce those cover crops without adversely affecting the yield of corn and soybean? That was the main heart of what we were trying to do.
What factors all went into your research then?
Well, we are thinking about both corn and soybean systems. So we're in continuous corn and we're in corn soybean systems at each of the 4 locations. So there are 3 sets of blocks. And within those we have 2 planting dates. You know, what happens if you seed cover crops into standing corn or soybeans? So we're going in late August, early September and broadcasting seed, simulating an aerial broadcast of corn, of cover crops. One during the growing season and then one right immediately after harvest. The one after harvest we're actually drilling.
What do the preliminary results show for what it means about the timing of getting a cover crop into a field?
It varies. You know, that there are times that I think the 2014 data showed that we get better stands with broadcasting seed in the season. It gives you about another month of growing season for the cover crops. Some of the Clay Center location last year actually showed that we did better when we drilled it after harvest. So it's got to be a soil moisture deal that is changing that. We lost a month of growing season for the cover crop, but we gained enough moisture that it was an advantage to wait. In terms of corn and soybean yields, most of them showed no difference at all. We've seen a couple places where we've reduced corn or soybean yields a little bit. So there is a trade-off on that. We have been successful in producing some degree of cover crop in some of the treatments, but not all of them. A lot of the treatments, the cover crops just don't do very well.
That moisture topic has to be of concern. What have you learned about the moisture that it takes or might take away from the crop?
Well, in 2015, it wasn't a big deal in terms of going, the material we planted in 14 going into 15, it affected yields, like I said, at one location in one of the cropping systems. I think it was about 10 bushels on corn we lost, which is pretty minor compared to everything else that was going on that was showing no difference. This year, we have a dry spring. People have been out soil sampling in our plots this year, and there's going to be a significant difference with a cover crop that's producing some biomass like it is. It's using water, it's drying the soil out. If we don't get significant rain before planting or early in the season, it may impact yields on corn and soybean both.
Let's talk about this field here in Havelock in Lincoln that's become, as you said, kind of a spin-off to the initial research. Tell me what you're doing and what you're trying to learn.
This situation, the idea, the Corn and Soybean Board allowed us to get started in thinking about cover crops, and you find this whole thousands of questions that revolve around it. One is we're trying to study here and at Clay Center here at Havelock, and that deals with, we have 5 different planting dates of cover crops here and 5 different species into corn at various times, starting at planting of corn. So some people are planting cover crops at the same time as corn. we're coming in at V6 to V7 on corn and doing the same thing, and then later in the season for 3 other planting dates.
Is there any initial conclusion to draw?
Yeah, if you plant a good stand of cover crop with corn at the time of corn seeding, corn yields are going to be sacrificed. There's no question about that.
By how much?
Considerable. It would not, if you're looking for improving corn yields, I can't remember the exact number. I think we're talking 30 to 40 bushels of corn versus 200 and plus.
Is there a noticeable benefit to the cover crop, however?
It is if you want some of that early season grazing. But if you're looking for fall grazing, that was not the way to get to it. These kinds of systems are better if you seed later in the summer, if you're looking for fall or spring grazing.
So where do you go from here, Roger?
We continue study. We've got a study looking at changing corn and soybean varieties, different maturities, to see if we can get out of the field earlier without sacrificing corn and soybean yield significantly, but allowing us to get more time for cover crop establishment and fall growth. If you're into cattle, cover crops, you're willing to take some of those trade-offs with corn and soybean yields.
The CropWatch website has a specific section dedicated to the use of cover crops. We'll link to that site on our homepage if you're interested in learning more. Nebraska's producers will be able to recycle their pesticide containers for free at 24 sites this season in the 25th year of the state's recycling program. UNL says applicators have accumulated more than 2 million pounds of containers since 1991. To learn more about the program and how you can participate, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Ben Beckman earlier this week.
The Pesticide Container Recycling program is a program that we've actually been doing for about 25 years here in Nebraska. It's a program that we use to gather in used pesticide containers and dispose of those in a way that's a little bit more environmentally friendly than getting rid of those at a landfill or burning them.
Tell me about the process.
Sure. So any sort of pesticide applicator can go into one of our sites. We've got multiple sites around the state. The best way to kind of figure out where some of those sites are is to go onto our website, pested.unl.edu/recycling, and that's going to give you a list of the multiple sites around the state. Some of those sites are going to be open year-round. Some of them are open seasonally. Some of those have a single day, and some of them you have to actually go into and make some sort of arrangement with the site in order for them to collect your pesticide container. But you can bring all of your used pesticide containers into that site, and they'll collect those for you, and they actually use those in a recycling process. They'll chip those up, and actually most of them get used for corrugated pipe for drainage tile later on.
What does the producer or the applicator need to do with the containers before they take them in?
The applicator needs to make sure that those containers are triple rinsed or pressure rinsed before they come in. Make sure that any of the caps are removed. The caps are actually a different type of plastic, so they can't be recycled, along with the container, and any sort of loose label, plastic label that can slip off, the booklets that come with that or anything like that also need to be taken off of the container. And those containers need to be, like I said, either triple rinsed or pressure rinsed, and then allowed to dry a little bit so that there's not extra liquid sloshing around inside those.
That wash water, what is that used for?
That rinsate then needs to be disposed of properly. Usually the label's going to give you any sort of recommendations for how to dispose of that rinsate. Usually it needs to be applied on site. You can throw it in, maybe you're cleaning out your spray tank or something like that. You can throw it in with the water that you're using for that and get rid of it on site.
Is UNL's PestEd the sponsor of this program then?
Actually, the sponsor of the program is the Ag Pesticide Container Recycling Council, and the UNL Pesticide Safety Education Office is just the coordinator, and we work in cooperation with the different co-ops and different sites that sponsor the sites. So we're just kind of the coordinator that lines up the people and lines up the sites.
Reinforce me the importance of recycling rather than just tossing it out.
Sure. So, I mean, it's a really great thing for our environment. Those pesticide containers, we go through a lot of them throughout the year. The sites are going to take any sort of pesticide container, anywhere from a 1 gallon jug to a 55-gallon drum. So even if you're using large commercial application size pesticide containers, we're able to take those and dispose of those properly in a way that's going to be a lot more environmentally friendly and put them into a good use as opposed to just throwing them in a landfill somewhere.
You can find more information about the Pesticide Container Recycling Program on the Market Journal website. The April Nebraska farmer says Jim Jenkins has a new power source for his farm shop. Jenkins recently finished installing a 25 kilowatt solar panel system at his ranch near Callaway. This month's magazine says the project was completed by Solar Heat and Electric of Omaha and is one of a few new solar projects being installed around the state for agricultural use. The company says Jenkins' system should produce 40,000 kilowatt hours per year and provide annual profits of about $4,000. You can read more about the energy source in the April Nebraska Farmer. The USDA's weekly crop progress report shows the U.S. is in the early stages of the 2016 corn planting season. Producers have put 4% of this year's crop in the ground, a pace that matches the country's 5-year average. Texas leads the way with 46% complete, while growers in Iowa and Nebraska have yet to record a percent. Looking ahead, we recently talked with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamara Jackson-Zims to see what farmers in this state should know about corn seedling diseases.
Well, there are a number of seedling diseases that we can see in, of course, corn and soybean, but looking strictly at corn, there's about 3 in particular caused by different fungi or fungal-like organisms that we want to watch out for.
And those 3 are?
In particular, in the last couple of years, we've seen more Pythium for one thing, and especially during wet conditions when we've had the rainfall events and ponding in the field. Well, that's a fungal-like organism that likes ponding and water because it has spores that swim, and so it needs that wetness. And even though we have seed treatment fungicides on most of our corn, having favorable weather conditions and a lot of pathogen, they can overcome some of those treatments.
And the other 2?
We can also see Fusarium, another fungus, or Rhizoctonia, and each of these fungi kind of have different weather conditions that they are favored by, and so it's always a possibility, and it can have an impact on our stand.
Are these problems that would continue from year to year in certain areas or in certain fields?
Absolutely, and so unfortunately these fungi all survive for long periods of time in the soil, and so it's likely that when weather conditions are favorable and we have those, you're going to see those diseases come up year after year.
Are there any diseases that would be problems if you're using continuous corn on corn, a rotation like that might cause a problem?
Well, definitely we see some diseases that are worse. Many of these pathogens, because they do overwinter for so long, they may not be noticeably worse, possibly though in some of those conditions.
What management options exist?
Well, fortunately, since we do already have seed treatments on all of our corn, that is going to help us manage them to a large extent. However, if you have fields where you have a chronic annual problem, there might be a possibility that in-furrow fungicides might help, but we really don't have much data to support that yet. And a lot of university pathologists are working on that and evaluating some of those, so stay tuned for more results later.
If there's a need to replant in certain areas, do you need to do anything differently?
Often, when we have a replant situation, the soil conditions and the weather have changed enough that you might not see the same disease reoccur. However, when we have those extended long periods of time where we're wet or cool, we can continue to see that, and sometimes the second round it can be worse, so we want to definitely pay attention to that.
Throughout the growing season, you can learn more about corn diseases in the MJ Extras tab located at the top of the Market Journal homepage. It contains more information from Tamara about topics including rust identification and northern corn leaf blight management. Now, with this week's weather outlook, here's Nebraska Extension Associate State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Last week when we gave the forecast, we talked about a upper air low that would be moving into the northwestern United States, translating its way through the central Rockies, and then cutting off as it got into the central plains. Models have been fairly consistent with that forecast, and with that forecast, they were depicting some heavy precipitation that would likely break out across at least the western half of the high plains regions of Nebraska, all the way southward through the Texas Panhandle. It looks like that's going to come to fruition. If we look at the quantitative precipitation forecast, anywhere from 3 upwards of 6 inches of rainfall, depending on location, expected from the Texas Panhandle northward through the Nebraska Panhandle. Now, certainly everybody won't get these exact amounts, but it does indicate that we are going to see a period of very heavy precipitation develop as we go through this weekend, primarily impacting western Nebraska, with lesser amounts to eastern Nebraska. During this last week, of course, in eastern Nebraska, we've been dealing with the higher winds, but more importantly, we've been dealing with some air quality issues as the Flint Hill burning has been progressing, and as the nights progressed, of course, we see the decoupling of the winds and that smoke accumulate on the surface, only to wait until we got some wind picking up during the daytime to scour that out. That issue looks like it's going to go to rest here as we move into early next week and the precipitation starts moving into our region. And more importantly, with this heavy precipitation, I'm expecting that we'll start to see some delays in planting that kicked off this week, because we're looking at 4 or 5 days of extended precipitation with cloudy conditions. We get a couple-day break and then yet another system depicted in the models to come moving into the Central Plains. Potentially it will cut off also, so this could be a very wet end to the month. Let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store. Here's that upper air low. It's not expected to move much today, so in the atmosphere, winds are moving from the south to the north, at the surface from the southeast to the northwest. That's bringing that deep moisture up into central Colorado. Expecting 1 to 2 foot of snow today, potentially a couple more feet in the Rock Mountains as we go through this weekend. So we're looking at 2 to 4 feet potential, with even more depending on how fast this low moves. And then some of that snow will spread out into the Plains region potentially as we go into tomorrow, and some of that snow may mix in with the rain in the Panhandle. Right now we're not expecting any accumulations, but a couple of degrees difference in temperatures, and we could see some very wet snow accumulating. As we go to tomorrow, we'll start to see that low moving out a little bit, so the snow rain line will move a little bit farther into the eastern Panhandle, and the precipitation will likely break out across the western half of the state with more scattered precipitation in eastern Nebraska. I think we're going to be fine for today in regards to the spring game. More cloudiness issues, but nothing in the way of significant moisture. Now as we go into Monday, the system starts to move out and we start to see an increase in moisture across eastern Nebraska, and starting to see a die off of the moisture in western Nebraska. As we go into Tuesday, that system starts to fall apart, so we're going to see scattered shower activity. And as we go into Wednesday, now the system starts completely falling apart, and we get the chance for some scattered cloudiness and sunshine breaking out during the afternoon. And as we get into Thursday, right now the depiction is this low will move off. We'll start to see clearing conditions, warmer temperatures, and that will continue into Friday before yet another system comes on board. So overall, 3 to 6 inches possible western Nebraska during this period, 1 inch in eastern Nebraska. And as we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, we're looking at above normal temperatures everywhere. And in terms of precipitation, here comes the next system.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA's April crop report, cover crops research, pesticide container recycling, and corn seedling diseases. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Roy Smith will look at corn and soybean markets, and Lauren Giesler will discuss soybean seedling diseases. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.